Over the Garden Wall is a 10-episode Cartoon Network miniseries that aired in 2014. In this video, I'll be going through all 10 episodes in the series, giving each of them a score, and reviewing the entire series at the end. Also, spoilers for all 10 episodes coming up. Without any further ado, every episode of Over the Garden Wall reviewed. Chapter 1, The Old Grist Mill. Lost in the mysterious woods of the unknown, two brothers named Wirt and Gregory run into a jaded old woodsman. The entire series, but especially this episode, becomes better once you've seen the show one time through. The opening sequence is fantastic, showing the characters that Wirt and Greg will meet throughout their journey. The song is obviously great too. It gives off kind of an old-timey folktale vibe that the entire series goes off of. The whole beginning makes for an excellent start to the series. Despite having some dark moments, a large part of this episode and the series is just goofy fun. These jokes can sometimes be kind of hit or miss though. For example, Wirt's frequent poetry comes off as a bit off for the character. Beatrice is also technically in this episode, but the woodsman is really the side character who is fleshed out in this one. While him just leaving the brothers alone is a bit of plot convenience, the dog reveal is creepy without just being a jump scare, and the following chase scene is wonderful. The way the dog just gets crushed along with the rest of the house is kind of terrifying and comedic. The woodsman not allowing Wirt to blame Greg entirely, as Wirt is the one who should be looking after Greg, sets up Wirt's arc for the season well, while also characterizing the woodsman. The ending sequence is nice too, with Wirt finally putting up with some of Greg's antics. The episode does a pretty good job setting up the season, while having some difficulty mixing the comedic and more creepy sections. Greg knocking out the woodsman because Wirt mentioned it is a weak excuse to have the woodsman not be there, and Wirt telling his brother to go outside by himself because he's too busy reciting poetry was also a bit ridiculous. Still, the series opener introduces the world incredibly well and sets Wirt and Greg out on their journey through the unknown. Chapter 2. Hard Times at the Huskin Bee. A bluebird named Beatrice offers to guide Wirt and Greg to Adelaide of the pasture, the good woman of the woods, and to help them get home. Beatrice's real introduction is a bit confusing, but she still works well with Greg and Wirt as the third member of their group. Again, this episode, she's pretty characterless, so the focus is instead on Wirt and the people of Pottsfield. Unlike the last episode, which only had a few moments of creepiness, this episode is filled with creepy twist after creepy twist. The Pumpkin People and Enoch make for great semi-antagonists, as they embody both a cult and just a group of regular people during a party for the harvest. After the work scene, which is accompanied by some great music, the actual harvest begins. Wirt in the audience slowly figuring out that they are digging their own graves is built up well, but once again, just like the sentencing, it ends up being more innocent than you think. The reveal that the Pumpkin People were actually wearing costumes only for them to be skeletons is nicely ironic, with the skeletons putting on the pumpkins leaving Wirt completely speechless is great too. Wirt thinking that they left him when in reality he just didn't notice he was free was a bit cheap, but it ends the episode fairly well. Also, this joke that ends out the episode when Greg asks why Beatrice is going to Adelaide is great too.
I guess in some ways, I'm trying to get home too.
That's vague.
This episode is a slight improvement to the first, with the Pumpkin People being such a contrast between nice country people and horrifying skeleton cult of the greater comedic moments, while unfortunately still faltering a little bit and mixing together comedic and non-comedic moments. Chapter 3, Schooltown Follies. Wirt, Greg, and Beatrice get all mixed up in the musical antics of a schoolhouse of animals. Forgetting about the creepy elements of the first two episodes, this one is nearly completely comedic. And although this sounds terrible, as I really did enjoy the less comedic parts of the other episodes, this episode is still fairly enjoyable. This episode has some great songs. The Teacher's Alphabet song is the one I found the funniest of the bunch.
And why, yes, why is the question that's on my mind.
The potato and molasses segment is fairly enjoyable too. It really pays off in the finale. Greg's more whimsy attitude and personality fit this whimsy episode fantastically. Seeing all the humanoid animals going to school and playing instruments is also strangely comforting. The whole scene commencing with the father of the school teacher ruining the party and taking the instruments feels like they're going to try to make him the villain of the story, but then the show takes a strange but welcome turn into making him an old man who's just trying to help educate the animals. Greg's suggestion to rob him is hilarious too, even if it was just to throw a banquet. While the gorilla being Jimmy Brown should have been obvious, the episode plays it off as the joke it is and just moves on. All the parts of the episode I've described so far make it sound like a fantastic episode, but if you've seen the show, you've probably noticed what I haven't mentioned. The entire time all this is happening, Beatrice and Wirt are having a fight over whether or not Wirt is a pushover, and the whole fight never amounts to anything. Wirt being willing to keep doing only what people tell him to, even if it means risking his brother and not trying to get home is a completely uncharacteristic moment for the usually more serious of the brothers. The whole fight never really pays off either, it just kind of ends along with the episode. This significantly slows down the episodes at times, as we have to stop watching Greg comedically mess around with animals in order to watch an unfunny, useless fight. Still, the episode has enough great moments to get around that. Chapter 4. Songs of the Dark Lantern. Beatrice is left out in the rain with a brainless horse while Wirt and Greg must ask for directions in a lively colonial tavern called the Dark Lantern. Another episode that is heavily musical, the tavern is the most alive-feeling place in the show so far. The tavern is filled with all of your stereotypical tavern people, so far as to be the joke of the episode, but the songs they sing bring their characters to life. From the wacky and strangely animated Highwayman song, to the great courting song, and even to the creepy tavern keeper song about the beast, all of these songs are incredibly catchy and have great choreography. The way the last song transitions into Wirt's belief that the beast might have been the Woodsman all along is fantastic, and Wirt riding with Gregory after Beatrice is some of the best action in the show. Wirt knocking the lantern onto the ground, setting the tree ablaze, and leaving the Woodsman in a panic is such a powerful scene, expertly broken up by the reveal that Fred could talk the entire time. Finally, the first appearance of the beast is horrifying, him being a faceless creature who can turn people into trees. The way the Woodsman isn't scared of him is something that's unique about the beast. Most villains of his type are all-powerful creatures, but the Woodman seems more angry than scared. This interaction is great, as it gives him a reason to keep the lantern lit and introduces the beast without giving too much away. This episode has a great musical sequence, a funny joke ending, a more serious plot-driven ending which introduces the main villain in a great way. The first truly fantastic episode of the series. Chapter 5. Mad Love. Is millionaire Quincy Endicott's sprawling mansion haunted by a beautiful ghost, or is the Tea Baron going mad? This episode begins rather abruptly, with the brothers, Beatrice, and Fred all at the Endicott's mansion. Immediately, this episode becomes nonsensical, as instead of asking the millionaire for 2 cents, they destroy his place looking for them. Fred makes for a terrible character this entire episode. His jokes aren't funny, he slows down the plot, and he leaves the gang with no real resolution. The show makes the mistake of putting all 3 of its completely wacky characters into one task, and the 2 more serious characters into the other. While this does make the Beatrice Wirt conversation pretty good, it leaves the ghost plot in a rough situation. Speaking of the Beatrice and Wirt conversation, while it is a little bit forced, giving some background for Beatrice was very necessary for the next episode to take place. Beatrice being on a quest to help her family also makes a lot of sense, and the scene allows for the reveal of next episode to hit a lot harder. Wirt's knowledge of architecture is just a random plot convenience and leaves their nice conversation on a bad note. The reveal of the mansion was actually 2 mansions that ran together is clever, but it doesn't really satisfy the spooky ghost subplot. And the entire episode being about getting 2 pennies for the fare, only for Greg to throw them in the fountain because he has
No sense. No sense at all.
Leaves the entire episode as another pointless adventure. Unlike the other episodes, which have either great moments, great jokes, or great songs, or usually all 3, this episode just drags on and leaves our characters practically right where they started. The pretty good conversation between Wirt and Beatrice is the only thing keeping this episode from being terrible. Chapter 6. Lullaby and Frogland. Wirt and Greg go on a lighthearted romp around the Frogland ferry as they approach Adelaide of the pasture. This episode is really split into 2 sections, the part on the boat and the part at Adelaide's. The part on the boat contains some of the best jokes in the entire series. Gregory's frog slowly turning into a more humanoid creature is hilarious, and the chase scene has some great gags. While the frog singing is admittedly a bit random, when the song name drops the series, it's pretty great.
And over the garden wall.
Again, Beatrice's sudden change in goal was a bit too immediate. Having her question what she was doing over the course of multiple episodes instead of all at once would have helped with the pacing. Then we get to the section of the episode where Wirt realizes that Beatrice was tricking the boys all along. Adelaide is an incredibly creepy villain, and while I do wish that she was on screen slightly longer than she actually was, her death scene was really cool and it leads to the best part of the episode. In a series with such wacky characters, it's shocking they're able to have such great character moments. The pain in both Wirt and Beatrice's voice as they leave her feeling betrayed is immensely powerful. Wirt mentions that he never should have trusted anyone and begins his near downfall as it leaves the entire episode on a somber note. This is arguably the most serious moment involving either of the brothers up until this point, and it's gladly welcomed. This episode is half hilarious, half heartbreaking, but entirely good. Chapter 7. The Ringing of the Bell. Wirt meets Lorna, a young woman forced to do housework by an odious witch with a magic bell. The episode begins with both Wirt and Beatrice being hopeless. hopeless. Both characters are starting to give up hope, word of giving home, and Beatrice of turning her family back into humans. Quickly after Wirt claims to Greg that he has a plan, we get a great scene with the Woodsman trying to warn Wirt. The way that Wirt notices the axe marks right before the Woodsman walks into frame is perfect. We learn that the beast can only turn children into trees once they have given up all hope of getting home. Now this is explained rather poorly at the time, partially so that Wirt doesn't fully comprehend it, but it still gets the point across without having to force too much plot convenience. Lorna and Auntie Whispers make for an excellent story, even if it doesn't relate to the main plot of the show that much. The duet between Wirt and Lorna does feel a bit forced, but the twist at the end is completely worth it. The entire time, you really have no reason to believe that Lorna is actually the person eater. The show manages to not outright say she is or isn't, but still heavily implied enough that you really don't think twice about it. The whole hypnotizing thing is great too. The entire section is fantastic until the end. The solution being just to shake the bell and tell the spirit to leave is slightly questionable, as Auntie Whispers didn't just try to do this, but as told at the end, it seems possible that Auntie Whispers didn't cure her because she wanted her to stay. Wirt goes back to hopelessness after the curing of Lorna, which just shows that having to leave Lorna made things worse. The Beast's little monologue afterwards is a bit cliche, as he states that he's glad that Wirt is losing hope, but the Woodsman saying that you can't trade children's souls leaves the entire episode with a feeling of dread. While a mostly non-plot episode this late sounds like it would be bad, the beginning and end have some great plot development, and the middle contains an excellently spooky story with a fantastic twist. Episode 8, Babes in the Wood. While Wirt and Greg lay down to rest, they're drawn into a dream world of cherubs, flowers, and clouds. Disregarding all the progress he's made this season, Wirt opens up the episode by getting annoyed by Greg again. And while parts of this was poorly written, like Wirt telling Greg to stop pretending they'll get home, it conveys such a feeling of hopelessness as Wirt realizes he has no plan to get back. Greg going to Cloud City is just a collection of either references to old movie makings or flat-out jokes. Some of these are pretty funny, and others just fall flat and seem to drag on. The songs in this episode are fine, but I find them to be weaker in comparisons to other ones in this series. Despite the mediocre middle part of this episode, things really start to pick up towards the end. The Queen of the Clouds showing that Wirt is going to be lost to the Beast forever, and finally gives Gregory a chance to prove he's not useless in the story. Often Greg is only delaying the group or doing things randomly, but here it shows that while he might not be the smartest, Greg is kind and compassionate. Greg telling Wirt he's leaving only for Wirt to not even turn around is heartbreaking. Again, the camera panning over to show the Beast as Greg walks towards him is horrifying. All this culminates in the final scene where Wirt gasps for air as he searches for Greg, only to fall into the lake. Going back to what the Woodsman said in episode 1, Wirt is responsible for what happened to him and his brother, and in this moment he realizes, asking what he's done before he falls into the lake. He is saved by Beatrice and the fisherman and becomes unconscious, setting up the next episode fairly well. This chapter has a pretty good start and excellent end, but the middle is a bit underwhelming. Chapter 9, Into the Unknown. The origin of Wirt and Greg's descent into the unknown reveals itself. This episode is vastly different from all the previous episodes. With no sense of fantasy until about the 10-minute mark, this episode takes on more of a teen comedy instead of its usual dark fantasy with more comedic elements than usual. This episode is funny, from more subtle jokes like the reveal that Wirt and Greg are wearing costumes the entire time, to less subtle jokes like the awkwardness from Jason Funderburker. Despite only being in this episode, the show does a great job in establishing characters like Sarah and Jason in only a tiny amount of dialogue. The way that Greg messes up everything for Wirt in a way that's actually helpful is a bit cliche, but the way that he just innocently messes with Wirt is pretty great. The actual story of this episode is nothing special, but the settings and jokes are to make it entertaining. The graveyard scene forcing the boys over the garden wall is neat, if not a bit ridiculous. The train forcing them down the hill and into the water is great too. The reveal that they've been drowning this entire time adds a sense of urgency for the last episode. The little part with Beatrice's family is good too, especially this line, which is heart-wrenching.
Be no good to your brother dead. I was never any good to him alive either.
Wirt has realized how awful he was to his stepbrother and is completely dedicated to getting him back. I'm glad they slid this episode at the end instead of at the beginning, as it would have started the series off on a non-fantasy note. But here it acts as a part comedic breather and part background episode. Chapter 10, The Unknown. The Beast has come, the final chapter begins. Starting off strong, this episode begins with the Beast trying to make Gregory give up. He makes him do seemingly impossible tasks in an effort to make him give up hope. Instead of going for the obvious ending Greg is too naive to ever give up, Greg actually starts to become an Edelwood tree. The Woodsman reaction to the fact that he's been grinding up children's souls in the lantern all these years visually shakes him to his core. The voice actor does a great job in conveying the pain in his voice. I do wish that they had toned down Greg's ridiculousness when he's literally dying. The line about eating leaves was fine, but everything after that seemed a bit tone deaf. Luckily enough, Greg quickly becomes unconscious and Wirt has an encounter with the Beast. Him figuring out that the Beast was the one in the lantern felt a bit like plot convenience, but the scene is just so incredible it can be quickly forgotten. The way the Woodsman quickly shows the horrifying body of the Beast before blowing out his spirit is fantastic, and the way it just cuts to the brothers in the lake makes for a great shot. Wirt getting his happy ending is fine. I'm glad they keep it somewhat open-ended whether or not the unknown was real. The little montage at the end is fantastic too, especially the ending to the Woodsman tale. While checking the other characters, especially seeing human Beatrice, was neat, the reveal that the Woodsman daughter was never even dead is a little bit of a forced happy ending, but the twist is good enough that it definitely improved the ending. A lot of what I have to say bleeds into the series overview, so I'll go ahead and get into that, but this finale is fantastic and ends the series in an incredible manner. By the way, this series overview will also kind of be a season overview, and the rating applies to both. Despite only taking 5 nights to air, the show has left a lasting impact on animation, and for very good reason. First, the animation in the show is very reminiscent of other cartoons, but occasionally the animation becomes incredible for a scene or two. Also, the show is incredibly funny. From subtle to extremely unsubtle, the show is constantly cracking jokes, even when it's a little bit less warranted. The songs are great too, some incredible catchy tunes in there. Over the Garden Wall also has some incredible characters. The Woodsman is a bit of a joke character at first, so once you learn his motives, his story becomes tragic as it becomes one of the best parts of the last episode. The Beast is an incredible villain. Despite not being incredibly powerful, or at least his power having limits, he is a looming threat for the entire 10 episodes. From subtle appearances to entire episodes, he torments the Woodsman and eventually our other characters too. His design is great too, both as the shadowy deer kind of guy to the actual illuminated look. Then we have our 3 main characters, Beatrice and the brothers. Beatrice kind of fades from being a main character at the end and kind of starts and finishes her entire character arc in the same episode. She is definitely one of the least impressive parts of the series, to me at least. Gregory is the much goofier of the brothers, often serving as the comic relief. I find this to be a double-edged sword. In some parts, he has some great jokes to make an episode great, and in other, he either ruins the mood or slows down the plot. His sacrifice for Wirt is one of the best moments in the series, though, as he gives it all for his brother, and Wirt doesn't even turn around for him. Speaking of Wirt, he's our main character, and while he's definitely less serious at times, he's often the brother with the more serious moments. Throughout the show, he becomes more accepting of his new brother, as Greg's sacrifice makes Wirt realize how much he cares about him. And even besides these, there are many great characters like Lorna, Auntie Whispers, and humans like Sarah and Jason Thunderbreaker. And while these characters do add to the humor of the show, they also add to what I think the best part of the show is: the show's abilities to bring its world to life. Places like Pottsfield and the Tavern feel alive because of characters like these. The story too, and the few episodes where it's the focus, is fantastic. Really, the Beast and Woodsman are the main characters of the underlying story. The Woodsman learns he's been burning children only to find out that his daughter was alive the entire time. And while he kills the Beast and his daughter is alive, the happy ending hides the fact that he's been burning lost children for years, all for no reason. It's because of things like this, the great music, characters, and immersive atmosphere, that I'm giving this show, and the first and only season, a 9 out of 10. This show is incredible, and I highly recommend that you watch it. My favorite episode was the finale, The Unknown, and my least favorite was Mad Love. This is the last season of the show, so next time will be something else. Oh, and also, if you're watching this on the day it comes out, or any anniversary, happy Halloween. Anyway, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.